Chapter 4. Pluralistic Spiritualism. The System of Leibniz. The philosophy of Hobbes was a reaction against that dualistic pluralism of the Middle Ages, which assumed the existence of God, finite spirits, and material bodies. Descartes had, it is true, challenged these doctrines, but he had too uncritically reinstated them all, by his teaching that the certain existence of myself implies the existence of a perfect God, and that God, because perfect, is incapable of deceiving us in our clear conviction that the world outside us exists. In spite of Hobbes, Cartesianism, the philosophy of Descartes, reigned supreme throughout the 17th century. Even the philosophers who differed from Descartes built up their philosophy on his principles. Most important of these systems, supplementing and correcting that of Descartes, are the teachings of Julius and Malebranche. Descartes, it will be remembered, inconsistently asserts both the utter unrelatedness and, on the other hand, the interrelation of a spirit with a body. Julius seeks to avoid this inconsistency by his teaching that finite spirit and finite body do not really affect each other, but that God works changes in a given spirit on the occasion of changes in the corresponding body, and changes in a body to correspond with the changes in a particular spirit. Thus, he teaches, God is the real cause of all changes, spiritual and bodily, and the interaction of finite spirit and finite body is only apparent. Similarly, Malebranche denies the activity alike of finite minds and of finite bodies, teaching that God is the only ground of activity, and that we perceive, not things external to us, but the ideas of these same things in the mind of God. Unquestionably, both these doctrines meet the particular difficulty in Descartes' teaching which they were framed to correct. They are powerless, however, against at least two other objections to qualitative dualism. In the first place, both Julius and Malebranche admit the existence of corporeal bodies, without offering any sufficient reason or argument for their being, whereas it may well be argued that if, as they teach, God alone causes our perceptions, we need infer objects corresponding with these perceptions. And, in the second place, neither doctrine overcomes the difficulty of the relation of God to matter, since, if he be pure spirit, in Descartes' sense, it is difficult to understand how he created matter, or how he can even have ideas of matter. Hobbes, as we know, has another solution of the difficulty which Julius and Malebranche, without full success, have tried to meet. The relation between bodies and spirits is, according to his teaching, readily explained, since spirits are ultimately bodily in nature. But this teaching, though it would indeed meet the difficulty, has been found to be in itself objectionable. For Hobbes not only does not base the doctrine on valid argument, but when he tries to define body, he conceives of always in terms which apply solely to spirit. His philosophy, therefore, though an uncompromising assertion of materialism, really is an implicit argument for idealism, the doctrine that there is but one kind of reality, the immaterial. Such a doctrine, no less than materialism, evidently meets the difficulty of the dualistic two-substance doctrine. Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz, first of the great German philosophers, adopts this idealistic solution of the problem involved in René Descartes' dualism. In other words, Leibniz teaches that there is fundamentally but one sort of reality, the spiritual, or, as he would say, the soul-like. The purpose of this chapter is, first, to outline the argument by which Leibniz reaches his conclusion, and second, to summarize his doctrine and its different applications. These aims, however, are particularly difficult of attainment. For Leibniz never wrote a complete and systematic treatise on philosophy. In truth, philosophy was but one of his many intellectual interests. He was mathematician, jurist, and historian, as well as metaphysical thinker. More than this, he lived always the active life of the diplomatist and courtier, never the life of the academic or professional philosopher. He spent nearly 10 years, after leaving the university, in the service of the Elector of Mainz and in diplomatic journeys, and in 1676, when he was but 30 years old, he entered on his long service to the House of Hanover. So it came about that he was mainly occupied with practical, rather than with speculative, concerns, and his philosophical works were not written with the purpose of setting forth consecutively and logically the principles of his system, but for the most part, each with some special purpose. To estimate some recent book, to outline the system for the use of a friend, to meet some special difficulty, or to answer some definite criticism. Only two of Leibniz's philosophical works, a thesis written during his university days, and the Theodicy written for the Princess Sophie Charlotte, appeared, during his life, in book form. For the most part, therefore, his philosophical writing consisted of his correspondence, still largely unpublished, and of papers contributed to the Acta Eruditorum, and to other learned journals of his day. To derive from these unsystematic, occasional writings a clear, consistent, and comprehensive account of Leibniz's philosophy is a task of greatest hazard and difficulty. Only, indeed, by verifying and supplementing one statement by many others, and by allowing for the particular attitude of the person for whom Leibniz was writing, is it possible to frame any such statement at all. 1. The System of Leibniz. The universe, that is, the all of reality, consists, in Leibniz's view, of an indefinite number of monads or soul-like substances, dominated by one supreme monad, God. It will be convenient to expound this doctrine, at first without any save incidental criticism. This exposition will fall under two main heads. A. The argument for the doctrine that the universe consists of immaterial and distinct realities, or monads. B. The teaching about the nature and the classes of the monads. It will be followed by a critical estimate of the system. A. The argument for the doctrine that the universe consists of immaterial monads. Leibniz accepts without question Descartes' doctrine that I myself and other spirits, or souls, exist. Thus, the fundamental problem of philosophy is for him the following. Is the spiritual the only sort of reality, or do ultimately non-spiritual realities also exist? Such realities, according to Leibniz, would be corporeal or bodily. He does not take into account the later conception of a kind of reality neither spiritual or corporeal, but fundamental to both. Now the attributes, according to Descartes and Hobbes, of corporeal reality are extension, or figure, and motion. The problem from which Leibniz starts reduces itself therefore to this. Are figure and motion ultimately real? This question he answers in the negative. Every extension is, in the first place, he points out, infinitely divisible. There is no surface so small that it is not abstractly possible to break it up, in conception, into smaller surfaces. But endlessness, Leibniz holds, is an irrational conception, therefore that which is by nature endlessly divisible cannot be an ultimate reality. It is impossible, he says, to find the principles of a true unity in matter alone, since matter is only a collection or mass of parts to infinity. For, as he elsewhere says, a continuum is not only divisible to infinity, but every particle of matter is actually divided into other parts different among themselves, and since this could always be continued, we should never reach anything of which we could say, here is a real being. In other words, since by ultimate is meant a further irreducible reality, that which is endlessly divisible cannot be ultimate. It is even more obvious that motion is not an ultimate, a self-dependent sort of reality. Motion, Leibniz says, if we regard only its exact and formal meaning, that is, change of place, is not something entirely real, and when several bodies change their places reciprocally, it is not possible to determine by considering the bodies alone, to which among them movement or repose is to be attributed. Evidently, that which is always relative to something else is not ultimately real. As merely extended or moving, non-spiritual or corporeal, things are not, Leibniz teaches, ultimately real. But it is possible, he suggests, to conceive of these non-spiritual things, not as static, but as dynamic realities, that is, as forces. Motion, he says, that is, change of place, is not something entirely real, but the force or the proximate cause of these changes is something more real. Motion and extension are thus conceived as manifestations or expressions of an underlying force. According to this view, the universe would be made up not of spiritual realities together with non-spiritual, extended, and moving things, but of spiritual realities together with non-spiritual forces. But when he seriously asks himself the question, what is force? Leibniz finds that he has no definite conception of force except as spiritual. The thought of anything as a force is a conception of it as in some sense like a willing, striving, working self. Thus, from the conviction that the nature of real unities consists in force, it follows, Leibniz says, that it would be necessary to conceive them in imitation of the notion which we have of souls. Leibniz's result is the following. He began by assuming the existence of non-spiritual realities, bodies. He discovers that these alleged non-spiritual things are in their ultimate nature spiritual. He finds confirmation of this conclusion in Descartes' doctrine about the non-spatial qualities of so-called corporeal things. Descartes had admitted that hardness, color, sound, and the rest are not the qualities of ultimately real and non-spiritual things, but themselves the modifications or experiences of conscious minds. On the other hand, he had insisted that extension is the real attribute of non-spiritual objects. Leibniz argues that extension and motion are on a par with the other qualities of supposedly non-spiritual things, and that if color and the rest are modifications of spirit, so, also, are size and motion. Size and motion, he says, are phenomena like colors and sounds, although they involve a more distinct knowledge. Leibniz does not elaborate this teaching, but his meaning is clear. All that I know about color, sound, and odor, and similarly all that I know of extension and motion, I know through perception. I describe my perception of a supposedly non-spiritual thing in, let us say, the assertion, I perceive a round, fragrant red apple. But if the assertion be challenged, if someone else assert that no round, red, and fragrant object is here, then I find myself able to say with assurance only this, that I am conscious in definite ways which I describe as color, smell, and form consciousness. In other words, that which is indisputably real in the thing turns out to be a complex modification of consciousness. And it is utterly arbitrary to hold with Descartes that, whereas the redness and the fragrance are modifications of spirit, the roundness is a non-spiritual character. He who will meditate, Leibniz says, upon the nature of substance, will find that the whole nature of bodies is not exhausted in their extension, that is to say in their size, figure, and motion, but that we must recognize something which corresponds to soul, something which is commonly called substantial form. The essence of the body, he writes a little later in a letter to Orno, cannot consist in extension, and we must necessarily conceive of something which is called substantial form. How Leibniz conceives this substantial form is clearly shown in another letter. Substantial unity, he says, calls for a thoroughly indivisible being, naturally indestructible. This characteristic cannot be found either in forms or motions, both of which involve something imaginary. It can be found, however, in a soul or a substantial form, such as is the one called the I. These latter are the only thoroughly real beings. So Leibniz reaches the conclusion that the alleged non-spiritual, or corporeal, realities are in the last analysis spiritual. This he argues on the ground that a corporeal reality must be conceived either as extended and moving or as a force, that an extension because endlessly divisible and a motion because always relative are not ultimate, that extensions and motions accordingly are to be conceived as effects or expressions of forces, finally that a force is inconceivable except as spirit. He confirms the doctrine by the observation that our only unchallenged assertions about extensions and motions, as about colors and hardnesses, concern these qualities conceived as modifications of spirit. The argument to show that ultimate reality is, all of it, spiritual should be followed by an attempt to prove the second of Leibniz's fundamental doctrines, the manifoldness, or numerical plurality, of the universe. Leibniz, however, never argues, he merely assumes, this fundamental multiplicity. It seems to him too obvious to need argument. Evidently, he holds, the universe, whatever its constitution, is compassed of many realities. B. Leibniz's doctrine of the classes of monads and of their nature. There are, Leibniz teaches, four main forms of monad, or soul-like reality. These are, the supreme monad, God, and, dependent on him, three types of finite monad. The rational souls, the sentient but irrational monads, the bare or simple monads, organic bodies and inorganic masses. 1. The supreme monad, God. By God, the supreme monad, Leibniz means, as Descartes had meant, an infinite, that is, utterly perfect spirit, a person of absolute power, wisdom, and goodness. This is, of course, the traditional conception of God which Leibniz takes over from his predecessors. His arguments for God's existence closely resemble Descartes', though Leibniz himself lays undue stress on certain points of difference. These arguments will be later discussed in more detail. Fundamentally, they are these. 1. From the possibility of the conception of an absolutely perfect being follows the existence of this being. 2. From the fact that concrete things and abstract truths exist, it follows that there must be a God, a perfect being, as their source, else there would be no sufficient reason of their existence. The supposed demonstration of God's existence has important consequences in Leibniz's system. For from God's perfection it follows both that the world of his creation is the best possible world, and also that all the finite monads must depend utterly on God. Leibniz's view of the nature of God will thus become more evident in the course of the discussion which follows, first of the nature of rational, of merely sentient, and of simple monads, and second, of their relations to God and to each other. 2. The finite monads. A. The characters common to all finite monads. By monad, Leibniz means, as has appeared, a soul-like reality, that is, a reality of the nature of the I. In my knowledge of myself, I have therefore, Leibniz teaches, the key to all reality. Accordingly, his method of discovering the characters of monads is mainly that of discovering the characters of the self. In order to determine the concept of an individual substance, it is good, he says, to consult the concept which I have of myself. The characters which Leibniz attributes to all limited realities, or, in his terms, to individual substances monads, are the following. 1. Dependence on the supreme monad, God. 2. Activity. 3. Separateness or isolation. 4. The unification of its own experiences. 5. The character of expressing the universe. 6. The character of being predetermined by God to harmony with other monads. 1. Every monad depends on God. Every monad is, in the first place, Leibniz teaches, in conformity with his doctrine of God's perfect power, dependent on God, the supreme monad, as its creator. Creation is expressly likened to the production of thought. The finite monad proceeds from God by a kind of emanation. He produces it just as we produce thoughts. There are many individuals, simply because God regards all aspects of the universe in all possible manners. And the result of each view of the universe is seen from a different position as a substance. 2. Every monad is active. Leibniz always asserts, and seldom argues, the activity of the monads. Substance, he says at the very beginning of the Principles of Nature and Grace, one of the completest summaries of his teaching, is a being capable of action. But though Leibniz does not supply a definition of activity or an argument for it, most of his readers will agree with him in assigning to the rational monad, the myself, an aspect of spontaneity, independence, or assertiveness, which may well be called activity. And empirical observation makes it fairly easy to transfer, in imagination, to corporeal objects the activity originally realized as characteristic of a self. Leibniz's teaching is thus the common doctrine that our notion of activity is gained wholly by observation of ourselves, that in attributing activity to inanimate objects, we really endow them with the sort of activity which we perceive in ourselves, and that, in fact, there is no activity save soul activity. 3. Every monad is absolutely separate from every other. The doctrine that every individual substance is a world apart, independent of everything else excepting God, is reiterated in each one of Leibniz's formulations of his doctrine. A particular substance, he says, in that earliest of his mature statements of doctrine, the discourse on metaphysics never acts upon another particular substance, nor is it acted on by it. It is not possible, he writes, nearly 10 years later, that any true substance should receive anything from without. There is no way, he says, in one of the very latest of his philosophical works, of explaining how a monad may be altered or changed in its inner being by any other created thing. The monads have no windows by which anything may come in or go out. It will be admitted that introspection seems to testify to the fact that every self is isolated. Our spirits live in awful singleness, each in its self-formed sphere of light or gloom. I am myself, no one else, a unique self. In being myself, I am what nobody else is or can be. I am conscious, indeed, of a chasm separating me from all other selves, and nothing can affect me, except what belongs to me or is a part of me. It appears, in truth, as Leibniz insists, that nothing can happen to us except thoughts and perceptions, and all our thoughts and perceptions are but the consequence, contingent it is true, of our precedent thoughts and perceptions, in such a way that were I able to consider directly all that happens or appears to me at the present time, I should be able to see all that will happen to me, or that will ever appear to me. This future will not fail me, and will surely appear to me even if all that which is outside me were destroyed, save only that God and myself were left. Besides asserting, on the basis of his knowledge of the myself, the separateness and uniqueness of the monads, Leibniz argues for this character on the ground of the relation of the monads to God. Since each monad is, in truth, one of God's views of the universe, it must reproduce God's characters, including his self-dependence. It must, therefore, be independent of everything except God. To this reasoning, Leibniz adds the wholly insufficient argument that because a monad cannot have a physical influence on the inner being of another, therefore the influence of one monad on another requires the intervention of God. Of course, the premise of this argument is true, since so-called physical reality has been proved to be spiritual, but the possibility of a non-physical influence of finite monad on finite monad is not thereby denied. An unexpressed argument at the base of Leibniz's doctrine of the isolation of the monads may, however, readily be discerned. It is this. Multiplicity, if fundamental and not superficial, implies separateness. For things which influence each other are not really many realities, but rather parts of one reality, that is, members of a system or group. But one of Leibniz's fundamental doctrines is that of the multiplicity of reality. Insofar as he is justified in this teaching, he is correct in the logical inference from it, the doctrine that the fundamentally many realities are unique and separate. It will be shown, however, that Leibniz assumes without proof the ultimate multiplicity. It follows from the isolation of the monad, as Leibniz does not fail to point out, that it is indissoluble and ingenerable. For if incapable of being affected by anything outside itself, it can neither be ended, nor could it ever have been begun. Only by a miracle, Leibniz says, could a substance have its beginning or its end. 4. Every monad is a unity of its own states. The individual concept of each person, Leibniz declares, includes, once for all, everything that can ever happen to him. In the end, this assertion, like all others which concern the monads, is based on the knowledge which each one of us has of himself. I am, or include within myself, all that I experience, and I have none the less an identity in spite of change. The present I is, in a sense, identical with the I which endured certain past experiences, and my future experiences will be referred to the same I. In Leibniz's own words, therefore, it must needs be that there should be some reason why we can veritably say that the I which was at Paris is now in Germany. But Leibniz is not satisfied with this mere appeal to experience, and proceeds to explain the identity of the monad by a logical analogy. My inner experience, he says, convinces me a posteriori of this identity, but there must also be some reason a priori. It is not possible to find any other reason, excepting that my attributes of the preceding time and state, as well as the attributes of the succeeding time and state, are predicates of the same subject, since from the very time that I began to exist, it could be said of me truly that this or that would happen to me. We must grant that these predicates were principles involved in the subject or in my complete concept, which constitutes the so-called I, and which is the basis of the interconnection of all my different states. These God is known perfectly from all eternity. The identity of the self is further shown, Leibniz teaches, by an analysis of the concept of change. For, in order that there may be change, not mere succession, there must surely be something which changes, and this something must be one throughout its succeeding states. 5. Every monad mirrors or expresses all reality. But Leibniz teaches not only that a monad is a unity of all its own experiences, besides these, in its full concept are included all the attendant circumstances and the whole sequence of exterior events. There was always, Leibniz says, in the soul of Alexander marks of all that had happened to him, and evidences of all that would happen to him, for instance that he would conquer Darius and Porus. Therefore, that which happens to each one is only the consequence of its complete idea or concept, since this idea already includes all the predicates and expresses the whole universe. Leibniz teaches, it thus appears, not only that in a sense every substance is absolutely complete, but that it expresses all reality. For this doctrine, Leibniz advances an argument like that on which he had based his doctrine of the isolation of the monads. Every monad is the emanation or effective thought of God. But God is absolutely perfect or complete, therefore that which expresses him must share in his completeness. It is very evident, Leibniz says, in a passage already quoted in part, that created substances depend upon God who preserves them, and can produce them continually by a kind of emanation, just as we produce our thoughts, for when God turns, so to say, on all sides and in all fashions, the general system of phenomena which he finds it good to produce, and when he regards all the aspects of the world in all possible manners, the result of each view of the universe is seen from a different position, is a substance which expresses the universe conformably to this view, provided God sees fit to render his thought effective, and to produce the substance, it follows that each substance is a world by itself. In other words, because every monad is one of God's ways of viewing the universe, and because God is perfect, or complete, therefore every monad expresses, or, as Leibniz often says, mirrors, the whole universe according to its way. By this statement, Leibniz explains, he means that every monad, in that it is an I, is conscious of the whole world, that, to a degree, it knows the whole universe. In my own person, therefore, I reconcile the separateness and the apparent harmony of the individual. I am my separate isolated self, incapable of getting out of myself, or away from my own experience, and yet I find myself conscious of other selves and things. I mirror and portray the universe, in knowing it, and yet my knowledge never takes me outside my separate and distinct self. This theory obviously involves two difficulties. It may be true that I express the universe by being conscious of it, but it is hard to see how an inanimate object, say a rock, expresses the universe in this way. But if Leibniz has been successful in the proof that all realities are souls, it must follow that they are conscious. A second problem is the following. How can Leibniz teach that a finite monad knows the whole universe? For is it not obvious that no single, finite self, or monad, can know the entire universe? Leibniz answers squarely by reaffirming that each soul knows the infinite, knows all, and he seeks to justify the teaching by insisting that we have an indistinct and confused consciousness of much that we do not clearly know. Of such a character, he holds, is our knowledge of that which we do not immediately experience or logically infer. To the consideration of both difficulties we shall later recur. 6. Every monad has been predetermined by God to be in harmony with every other. The pre-established harmony of the monads is a theory which Leibniz formulated in the face of the following difficulty. His doctrine that each monad expresses the entire universe seems to oppose his equally emphasized doctrine that each monad is separate from every other. He teaches, as has just appeared, that given Adam, all the events of the universe are given, or that given Alexander, the conquest of Darius is therewith assured. But if the existence of Adam is implied by my existence, it may well be urged that Adam and I are not absolutely separated and independent of each other. It may be urged, also, that the interrelatedness of minds, or spirits, with things is at least as obvious to ordinary observation as their separateness. I am not merely conscious of my isolation, I am equally conscious of my vital connection with the other spirits of my world. I live not only in awful singleness, but in close relation to these other spirits, and this must mean, it is urged, that I affect them and am in turn influenced by them. To such mutual influence, not to a perfect isolation, all the facts of social intercourse, for example, question and answer, and cooperation in labor, seem to bear witness. So-called physical realities, also, are closely bound together in the relation of cause and effect, so that from the condition of one object, we may actually infer that of another. All these commonplaces of observation tell against Leibniz's doctrine of the isolation of realities, and he himself admits this apparent interconnection, saying that phenomena maintain a certain order conformably to our nature, from whence it follows that we can make useful observations, which are justified by the outcome of the future phenomena. Leibniz's way of reconciling these apparently opposed characters of monads, their isolation and their conformity of behavior, is by what is known as his doctrine of pre-established harmony. God, from whom each of the created monads emanates, as a thought from its thinker, has so conceived, or created, each soul, that each of its thoughts and perceptions shall correspond with each of the changes in all the other monads, which together constitute the universe as finite. God, he says, has first created the soul, or any other real unity, so that everything shall grow out of its own depth, by a perfect spontaneity on its own part and yet with a perfect conformity to outside things, and so it comes about that, though each of these substances exactly represents the universe after its manner, and according to a certain point of view, and though the perceptions or expressions of external things arrive in the soul in virtue of its own laws, and as if there existed nothing save God in the soul, still, there will be a perfect accord among all these substances, which produces the same effect as if they communicated with each other. It is this mutual relation, regulated in advance, within each substance of the universe, which brings about what we call their communication. In replying to the difficulties found by Foucher in this system of pre-established harmony, Leibniz made use of an illustration which at once associated itself with every statement of the theory. Imagine, he says, two clocks and watches which keep exactly the same time. Now this may come about in three ways. The first is that of mutual influence, the second is to put them in charge of a clever workman who shall keep them in order and together, at every moment, the third is to make the two timepieces with such art and precision, that one assures their keeping time together in the future. Now put the mind and the body in place of these two clocks, their accord may come about in one of these three ways. The theory of influence is that of the everyday philosophy, but since one cannot conceive of material particles which could pass from one of these substances to the other, this conception must be abandoned. The theory of the continual assistance of the Creator is that of the system of occasional causes, but I hold that this is to make God intervene, as a deus ex machina, in a natural and ordinary situation, where, according to reason, he ought to cooperate only as he does in all other natural phenomena. Therefore there remains only my hypothesis, that of harmony. From the beginning, God has made each of these two substances of such a nature, that in following only its own laws, received with its being, it nonetheless is in harmony with the other, just as it would be if they mutually influenced each other. The relatedness of the different monads is thus, fundamentally, an interconnection among the resolutions of God. b. The classes of created monads. 1. The rational monads. Conscious, moral selves. By rational monad, Leibniz means such a self, or spirit, as any human being knows itself to be. Leibniz, Spinoza, or the Electra Sophia. Leibniz does not argue for the existence of the rational self, but asserts it on the unimpeachable testimony of consciousness. The existence of many human selves, other than the mere myself, Leibniz usually assumes, for it does not occur to him that this could be questioned. Yet his teaching that a varied multiple universe follows from the infinite variety of God's perfections, offers a general argument for the multiplicity of selves. From all other finite substances, the rational monads are distinguished by the clearness and distinctness of their consciousness. This cardinal difference implies two contrasts. Rational selves alone have reason, in addition to perception and memory, and rational selves alone are morally free and responsible. The character of freedom involves such difficulty that it must be considered at more length. Rational monads, Leibniz teaches, incline to choices under no compulsion of necessity. So far as this means merely that a rational being is under no compulsion from other finite beings, it is of course entirely consistent with Leibniz's teaching. But Leibniz seems to mean more than this, namely, that the individual, rational soul, and not God, is author of its own choices. The proof he offers for the theory is the attempted demonstration that the acts of the finite rational self are contingent acts, therefore not necessary, therefore free. To prove the acts of every rational being contingent, Leibniz makes and emphasizes the contrast between necessary truths, or truths of reason as he calls them, whose opposite is not possible, and contingent truths, whose opposite is possible. The truths of geometry, for example, the theorem that the sum of the angles of a triangle is equal to two right angles or the theorem that alternate internal angles are equal, are examples of necessary truths. Their opposite is inconceivable. On the other hand, the fact that Leibniz visited Spinoza in The Hague is a contingent truth, for Leibniz might possibly have found Spinoza at Amsterdam, or he might have gone from Paris to Hanover without visiting Spinoza. From this justifiable distinction between necessary and contingent truths, Leibniz then draws the following conclusion. The acts of a rational being can be imagined as different from what they actually are, that is, their opposite is conceivable or possible, therefore these acts are contingent, and as contingent they are free, not necessary. But this conclusion is invalidated by the ambiguity of the word possible. Leibniz uses it first as equivalent to conceivable, that is, imaginable, and second as equivalent to contingent, that is, not necessary. Now, in the first sense, the opposite of a given action certainly is possible, that is, one may always imagine a given person as behaving otherwise than in the way in which he actually behaves. For example, one may imagine Leibniz as going not to The Hague, but directly to Hanover. But it is illogical to argue from the fact that one may imagine Leibniz as going to Hanover on a certain day, to the conclusion that it was really possible for him to go to Hanover on that day. In truth, this conclusion seems wholly inconsistent with Leibniz's teaching that both Leibniz and Spinoza were created by God, and that it was contained in God's conception of both philosophers that they should meet, in 1676, at The Hague. It must be admitted, then, that Leibniz does not prove that the acts of rational beings are contingent or free. Yet he holds to the doctrine of freedom, doubtless because only so can he reconcile the fact of moral evil with his doctrine of the goodness of God, and because, also, the belief in freedom and responsibility seems to him necessary to the moral life of rational selves. In this mainly unargued conviction the force of Leibniz's doctrine of freedom really lies, and on the facts of the moral consciousness, an argument for freedom, far stronger than his, may be based. 2. The sentient monads. Irrational souls. Leibniz sharply distinguishes the merely sentient, irrational souls of animals from the rational, self-conscious souls of human beings. Animal souls, he teaches, have perception and memory, but they have neither explicit self-consciousness nor reason nor moral freedom. The difference is, he holds, a difference in clearness of perception. Both animal and rational souls perceive, and thus express, the whole universe, but the animal souls only confusedly. This important distinction of clear from confused consciousness will be considered in discussing Leibniz's doctrine of the third group of created monads. 3. The simple monads. Simple monads, according to Leibniz, constitute the reality, as distinct from the appearance, of what are known as organized bodies and masses of inorganic matter. Corresponding to my idea of my own body or of my hat, there is something real, or, more definitely, a collection of reals. These realities are simple monads, perceptive soul-like substances, each an active, complete, isolated expression of the universe. It is essential to the understanding of Leibniz to realize that he never teaches that to each animal or inorganic body, as it appears to us, there corresponds but one monad, or soul. Such a view, he holds, is contradicted by the fact that every material body is subject to division and to transformation. A block of marble, for example, may be split into smaller blocks, and animal bodies may be mutilated or even reduced to ashes. If a body, as it appears to us, were a soul, it would follow then that the soul is divisible and destructible, for Leibniz, an impossible conclusion. Leibniz, in fact, regards everybody, organic and inorganic, not as itself a monad, but as an idea in our minds, to which corresponds a constantly changing collection of simple monads. These simple monads are in continual flux, forming part now of one body, now of another, and changing place either little by little, but continuously as in nutrition, or all at one time as in conception or in death. The only sense in which the particular, animal body, thus conceived, may be said to have unity, is because of the subordination of the simple monads, which compose it, to the sentient soul, or dominating monad. With this meaning, Leibniz says, in the letters to or no, a body is an aggregation of substances, and is not a substance, properly speaking. Bodies by themselves, without the soul, he says in a slightly earlier letter, have only a unity of aggregation, but the reality which inheres in them comes from the parts which compose them, and which retain their substantial unity through the living bodies that are included in them without number. It is not hard to assign a reason for Leibniz's teaching that inorganic and organic bodies represent a distinctive reality. There must exist, Leibniz argues, realities corresponding with our sense ideas or percepts. It is natural to believe that these realities behind sense ideas are things independent of consciousness, but Leibniz has argued that non-spiritual realities, whether conceived as extensions or as forces, are illusions, and that monads, soul-like substances, are the only realities. Berkeley, as will later appear, in face of this situation, boldly claims that God is the reality behind the external thing, and regards the thing as God's idea which he shares with me. But Leibniz, holding closer to the analogy of self-consciousness, preserves for the external object a peculiar reality, a distinct soul of its own. The difference, he teaches, between the simple and the sentient monad, the so-called material thing and the self, animal or human, is simply in the degree of the consciousness possessed by each. The simple monad, like the sentient monad, is perceptive. Leibniz never wavers in this declaration, else it would lose its soul-like character, But its perception is so indistinct, so confused, that the simple monad is fairly called insentient, a sleeping monad, as Leibniz often says. To show the plausibility of this conception of the so-called inanimate world as peopled with very dimly conscious souls, Leibniz recurs again and again to the difference, observed by each one of us, between the attentive and the inattentive consciousness. There are 1,000 indications, he says, leading to the conclusion that at every moment there are within us an infinity of perceptions, but without apperception and reflection, that is to say, that there are changes in the soul which we do not apperceive, because the impressions are too small or too numerous or too united, so that nothing distinguishes them. So, habit prevents our noticing the movement of a mill or of a waterfall, when we have for some time lived beside it. It is not that this movement does not always strike upon our organs, and that there does not occur something in the soul corresponding thereto, but these impressions are not strong enough to draw our attention and our memory. The perceptiveness of the simple monad is parallel, therefore, to our own inattentive, sleepy, unremembered consciousness. In other words, Leibniz teaches that, corresponding with every so-called percept of an object that I have, there exists a confusedly conscious soul, or collection of souls. And, to say the least, he shows the possibility of other than human and animal souls. We may well linger over the completed outline of Leibniz's picture of the universe. It is a living, spiritual world of active forces, or souls, each complete in itself, and working out its own ends in obedience to its own laws, each distinct from every other, yet harmonized with all the rest in its purpose, and in its capacity to mirror all the universe. The creator and harmonizer of all these spiritual forces is the supreme monad, God, a conscious being of absolute power, wisdom, and goodness. And closest to him in the scale of perfection are the free, self-conscious souls, forming, as Leibniz says, a republic of spirits of whom, nonetheless, God is monarch. 2. Critical estimate of the system of Leibniz. From this summary of the principal teachings of Leibniz, it is evident that Leibniz agrees with Descartes and with Hobbes in conceiving the universe as made up of many individuals. The system of Leibniz is, in other words, numerically pluralistic. Indeed, Leibniz lays far greater stress than Descartes, or even Hobbes, on the multiplicity of the universe, and on the consequent uniqueness and separateness of the individuals who constitute it. In contrast with Descartes, and in agreement with Hobbes, Leibniz further teaches that there is but one kind of reality. In other words, his philosophy is qualitatively monistic. But in strong opposition to Hobbes, Leibniz holds that this one kind of reality is immaterial or ideal. Whereas Hobbes formulates a pluralistic materialism, Leibniz teaches a pluralistic idealism, and more definitely, a spiritualism. Both by his monism and by his idealism, Leibniz meets real difficulties in the systems of his predecessors. His monism, that is, his teaching that all real beings are fundamentally of one sort, spiritual, avoids the absurdity of Descartes' doctrine that bodies and spirits, though unlike and utterly independent, nonetheless affect each other, and avoids as well the difficulty in Descartes' teaching that extension only, of all the qualities of corporeal bodies, is independent of mind. And Leibniz's idealism meets also the inconsistencies and difficulties of the materialism of Hobbes. But Leibniz's system must be estimated, not only by evaluation of its results, in comparison with the conclusions of his predecessors, but by a scrutiny of the cogency of his arguments. Thus estimated, his philosophy is frankly disappointing, largely because of the unsystematic development of his thought and expression. Indeed, the value of Leibniz consists rather in the presentation of his own insights than in the organized argument for his conclusions. Here and there, it is true, for specific parts of his doctrine, he attempts detailed proof, but often serious argument fails altogether. Often it is barely suggested, not sufficiently developed. Often, finally, the validity of his argument cannot be admitted. This general comment must be made good by restating, summarizing, and supplementing the criticisms made already on Leibniz's arguments. It is perhaps unnecessary to remind the reader that criticism at this stage of our study must be provisional only, and that it must wait for completion on a wider and deeper acquaintance with philosophical systems. Such criticism may be based on the following brief outline of the doctrine, which omits entirely the discussion of subordinate questions, even when they are intrinsically important. According to Leibniz, a. The ultimately real is 1. Immaterial. 2. Multiple. b. The many immaterial beings, monads, include 1. God, the perfect monad. 2. Created spirits, sentient souls, irrational and free, b. Sentient only. 3. Simple monads, insentient but perceptive. 2 and 3. Dependent on God, harmonious, expressing universe, active, separate. 1. A. Estimate of Leibniz's doctrine of reality as immaterial and manifold. The first doctrine to be estimated is, it is evident, the teaching that the ultimately real is immaterial. The significance of Leibniz's adoption of idealistic doctrine is the greater, because Leibniz was no mere metaphysician. As he himself says, he departed very young from the domain of the scholastics, charmed by the beautiful way in which the mathematicians and the physicists explained nature. Both to mathematics and to physics Leibniz made contributions of the highest value, and to mechanical laws, which he conceived as ordered ways, in which material reality, the mass of simple monads, appears to us, he always attributed a great, though a subordinate, importance. Thus Leibniz's deliberate conclusion that force, the physical ultimate, is spiritual in nature, has peculiar value, in that it is the conclusion of a man who is scientist as well as philosopher. The writer of this book accepts Leibniz's doctrine that the real is the immaterial, and accepts the assertions on which it is based. 1. The assertion that extension and motion are not ultimately real, but manifestations of a deeper reality, either of force or of spirit. 2. The assertion that force can be conceived only as spiritual. But Leibniz barely indicates the arguments for these conclusions, leaving to later philosophers the detailed and explicit demonstration of his results. He might have argued in detail, as Berkeley did, for the doctrine that extension is on a par with color, sound, and the other non-spatial qualities admitted to be modifications of spirit. He might also have examined the current conceptions of force, and could then have shown that to the materialist force really meant no more than either 1. Motion, or else 2. The unknown cause of physical phenomena. In the first sense, however, as Leibniz might have proved, force would be, like extension, coordinate with the admittedly ideal qualities of color and the rest. In the second sense, force would mean cause of ideas, and therefore, because related to ideas, force could not be material in the full sense of the term, since it would not be unrelated to consciousness. To recapitulate, though Leibniz might, in the opinion of the writer, have justified the idealistic monism of his system, though he might, in other words, have proved what he taught, that reality is through and through immaterial, yet he never carries out this proof with sufficient clearness and detail. The second part of Leibniz's teaching is the doctrine that the universe consists, ultimately, of many distinct beings. This doctrine, also, is insufficiently established. For Leibniz bases it on superficial observation and on defective argument. He urges in its favor, first, the mere observation that there are many different beings in the world, and second, the argument that every finite being must be ultimately different from every other, since each is a distinct expression of the nature of God. But the undeniable fact that we observe many people, things, and thoughts does not disprove the possibility that these are ultimately parts of one, including being. And the argument based upon the relation of each finite being to God is invalidated by the inconclusiveness, which will next be set forth in Leibniz's arguments for God's existence. In technical terms, once more, the numerical pluralism of Leibniz, like that of his predecessors, is not satisfactorily demonstrated. He takes for granted and does not prove the existence of an ultimate multiplicity of monads, utterly isolated beings. From this comment on the foundation of Leibniz's teaching, it is necessary next to consider his specific doctrines about the multiple immaterial universe. In a word, to comment on the monad doctrine. B. Estimate of Leibniz's doctrine concerning God. Leibniz's arguments for the existence of God must first be considered, for from the existence of God, the supreme monad, a being infinite, eternal, and perfect, that is, an all-powerful, an all-knowing, and an absolutely good spirit, follow, as has appeared, many of the characters of the other monads. Leibniz's arguments, it will be observed, bear so strong a likeness to those of Descartes that they need not be discussed in detail. Like those, they are of two sorts, ontological and cosmological, or, in Leibniz's terms, a priori and a posteriori. Leibniz's statement of the ontological argument is the following. God alone, or the necessary being, has this prerogative that if he be possible he must necessarily exist, and as nothing is able to prevent the possibility of that which involves no bounds, no negation, and consequently no contradiction, this alone is sufficient to establish a priori his existence. This statement of the ontological proof supplements that of Descartes by giving reason why the idea of God, alone among other ideas, contains the idea of necessary existence. The reason is simply this, that no contradiction is involved in the idea of a perfect being. Leibniz's meaning is clearly the following. We may rightly question whether there corresponds to our idea of a given limited reality any existing thing, for not only are some ideas obviously self-contradictory, as, for example, the idea of a square circle, but even such an idea of a particular thing as has seemed to involve no contradiction may prove self-contradictory, since some of its supposed characters may turn out to be incompatible with others. But I mean by God a perfect being, one possessed of all positive characters, therefore no character asserted of him can contradict another. In other words, the idea of God involves necessary, because uncontradictable, existence, hence, as Descartes had argued, God necessarily exists. Leibniz adds nothing to the ontological argument save this reason for asserting that the idea of God includes that of necessary existence. There are difficulties in the teaching, but comment upon it is needless, for it after all leaves the ontological proof in essentials unchanged. Leibniz still argues from my idea of a necessarily existent, perfect being to the actual existence of that being, and the objection therefore holds against him which was urged against Descartes. What Leibniz claims to prove is that the idea of uncontradictable, and thus of necessary, existence belongs to God. What he does not and cannot prove is that God, though conceived as necessarily existing, does for that reason necessarily exist. Besides this a priori, or ontological, argument for God's existence, Leibniz, like Descartes, lays stress on a causal or, as he calls it, an a posteriori argument. The argument is twofold. It is necessary, Leibniz teaches, to infer God's existence as explanation, first of contingent things, and second, of eternal truths. The assumption on which both these arguments depend is known by Leibniz as the principle of sufficient reason. He lays great stress upon it throughout his writing, always treating it in connection with the principle of contradiction, as a self-evident and unquestionable truth. Our reasoning, he says, is based upon two great principles. First, that of contradiction, by means of which we decide that to be false which involves contradiction, and that to be true which contradicts or is opposed to the false. And second, the principle of sufficient reason, in virtue of which we believe that no fact can be real or existing and no statement true, unless it has a sufficient reason why it should be thus and not otherwise. The principle of sufficient reason is thus identical with Descartes' postulate of an ultimate cause. Like that, it contains two parts. First, the teaching that every finite being has a cause, that no limited being can be conceived, except as linked to some cause of itself, and second, the unproved assumption that there must exist some ultimate, satisfactory, in Leibniz's term, sufficient, cause. There are two kinds of truth Leibniz teaches, which must have a sufficient reason. These are the truths of reason and those of fact. By truths of fact, he means simply external things and ideas, bodies and the representations of them and souls. And for the whole sequence of the things which extend throughout the universe, there must be a sufficient reason. In other words, it would be possible to one who adequately knew to give a sufficient reason why things are as they are and not otherwise. But no one fact, whether external or internal, can be sufficiently explained by another fact, for the alleged explanation will itself need explanation, and will not be ultimate. In the words of Leibniz, though the present motion comes from the preceding one, and that from the still preceding one, we gain nothing however far back we go, for there remains always the same question. Thus it is necessary that the sufficient reason, which has no more need of another reason, should be found outside the series of contingent things, in a substance, which is cause of the contingent things, that is, in a necessary being carrying in itself the reason of its existence. Otherwise there would still be no sufficient reason at which one could end. Now this last reason of things is called God. And God must be existent, Leibniz sometimes adds, since existent things demand an existent cause. This last stage of the reasoning, from existent things to existent cause, is evidently based on Descartes' principle, already criticized, that the cause must contain at least as much reality as the effects. But God's existence is not merely necessary, Leibniz teaches, to explain the existence of concrete, finite things, truths of fact. It is required, also, to account for the existence of necessary truths, truths of reason. These truths of reason, truths for example of geometry or of arithmetic, are, he insists, actual facts of our experience. We are as truly conscious that 3 superscript 3 equals 27, as that a room is cold. They are distinguished in two ways from contingent facts. The certainty of them is not, in the first place, derived from repetition of experience. The sum of the angles of a triangle is as certainly known to be 2 right angles in the first apprehension of the theorem, as at any later time, whereas one certainty of any sense truth, as that the sun will set every 24 hours, is dependent on frequent repetition. It follows that one's certainties of fact are not universal. In Nova Zembla, for example, the sun does not set once in 24 hours, whereas the truths of reason are everywhere cogent. Truths of reason are distinguished, in the second place, Leibniz teaches, from truths of fact, on the ground that they are necessary, and their opposite is impossible, whereas truths of fact are contingent and their opposite is possible. Now the peculiarity of these truths of reason can be accounted for, Leibniz teaches, only if they are regarded as dependent in a special way on God. The peculiarity which distinguishes, for example, my conviction that 2 2 equals 4, from my belief that it will stop snowing, must lie in the truth that the former idea is a truth of God's mind. In this sense, Leibniz calls the understanding of God the region of the eternal truths. It needs must be, he says, that if there is a reality, in the eternal truths, this reality is based upon something existent and actual, and, consequently, in the existence of the necessary being in whom essence includes existence. The difficulties with these causal arguments for God's existence have really been indicated in the criticism upon Descartes. The postulate of both arguments, the assumption that things and truths must have not merely a cause, but an ultimate cause, has first to be questioned. For it is not proved by Leibniz, any more than by Descartes, that an ultimate cause, or sufficient reason, for everything must exist. Both Leibniz and Descartes show, it is true, that a reason is always sought, and that a finite reason must be insufficient, but neither proves, though in the view of the writer both might have proved, that a sufficient reason is inevitably to be found. But waiving this objection, and admitting the necessity for an ultimate cause, another difficulty must be pointed out. On Leibniz's principles, such a sufficient cause must be distinct from the finite things, in other words, must be possessed of the monad's distinctness, and must even be outside the series of finite things. This second character follows from the fact that an ultimate, a satisfactory, a sufficient cause, must be itself uncaused. But if the sufficient reason be both distinct from the finite things and out of the series of them, surely it cannot be related to them as their cause. The dilemma seems a hopeless one. If the ultimate cause be in any sense in the series of the finite things, it is itself in need of a cause, in other words, it is not really ultimate. If, on the other hand, the supposed cause be outside the series of finite things and distinct from them, it cannot be related to them at all, and evidently therefore cannot be the cause of them. To this estimate of Leibniz's argument for God's existence should be added a criticism of his conception of God's nature. Like Descartes, Leibniz holds that the perfection, or completeness, of God involves his goodness. But this conception has peculiar difficulties, because God's perfect goodness, in conjunction with his absolute power, seems incompatible with the flagrant misery and evil of the world. Leibniz tries in many ways to meet the difficulty. He suggests, for example, that the unhappiness of rational souls may be balanced by the happiness of a greater number of irrational souls, or that the unhappiness of any individual may be overbalanced by the higher quality of his happiness. He urges also that evil may be only partial, in other words, a transcendent element in the good. No one of these assertions, every careful reader of Leibniz will admit, is conclusively proved, and Leibniz in the end always gives up the task of explaining how unhappiness and sin may be reconciled with the goodness of an all-powerful God, contenting himself with the insistence that God must be good, because he is perfect, complete, and that his created universe, in spite of appearances, must be good at heart. The result of this criticism is to admit that Leibniz has not proved the existence of God. Yet it must be pointed out that he has at least a greater right than Descartes to the ontological, and to the causal arguments. The ontological proof argues from idea to reality, and for Descartes, who held that a portion of reality is non-spiritual, this inference from idea to reality is obviously less valid than for Leibniz, to whom the whole universe is ideal. Again, when the causal proof maintains that there is a sufficient reason for each finite fact, Descartes' system leaves a loophole for the fear that this principle of sufficient reason may not apply to that foreign sort of reality, body. Leibniz meets no such difficulty, since it is at least likely that his spiritual world is a reasonable world. In a word, Leibniz's proofs of God's existence, though as they stand inadequate, are entirely consistent with idealistic doctrine. Indeed, it well may be that philosophers after Leibniz will discover God as deepest reality and ultimate explanation of the universe. See estimate of Leibniz's doctrine of the finite monads. The failure of Leibniz to prove the existence of God undermines the rest of his teaching, for to him the universe is a concourse of souls, ranging from rational to insentient, with the supreme soul, God, as its creator, preserver, and monarch. From God emanates each soul, rational or insentient, to God is due the completeness and the harmony of the souls, each utterly isolated from all save God, and to God's perfection is due the ultimate goodness of this often so evil-appearing world. In more detail, those characters, attributed by Leibniz to the finite monads, which he argues on the ground of God's existence, must be yielded as unproved. First of these, obviously, is the dependence on God. Leibniz's universe, with God left out, is a world of self-dependent and coordinate spirits. And the other characters which Leibniz attempts to prove, from the relation of the limited monads to God, are their perfect harmoniousness, their completeness, their capacity to express the entire universe, and even their isolation from each other. It follows, if Leibniz has not succeeded in proving God's existence, that he has left these characters of his monads unsupported. It must be noted, in the second place, that the doctrine of the activity and of the internal unity of each monad is unaffected by the failure to prove God's existence, and the consequent relation of the monad to God, for these characters, as has been shown, are established by self-observation. I know myself as an active self, a unit of all my own experiences. And so far as Leibniz has established a right to conceive the universe as ultimately spiritual, he is justified in conceiving every real being as active, and as internally a unity. It is possible on Leibniz's principles to rescue two more characters of the monads. their harmoniousness, and their isolation if that is not conceived as absolute. For both characters are established by the certainty I have of my own experience. The facts of my social consciousness, the observed sympathy, imitation, and loyalty inherent in me, indicate that I am a related self, not a lonely self, and yet my aggressiveness, my independence, and my sense of responsibility mark the distinctness of myself from other selves. A monad, then, if it is a soul-like reality, must possess a relatedness and a relative distinctness as well. The results of this commentary on Leibniz's doctrine concerning the nature of the monads is, then, the following. In the writer's opinion, Leibniz rightly holds, however ineffectively he argues, that each monad is one and is active. He rightly holds that it stands in relation to other monads, and that it yet is unique among them. He fails to complete his proof that there exists a God on whom each monad is dependent, nor does he prove that each monad completely includes and expresses the universe, and that it is utterly separate from every other monad and unaffected by it. To have pictured in ineradicable outlines a universe of unique yet related spirits is thus the unassailable value of Leibniz's philosophy. He did not, it is true, complete the building of his city of spirits. It was left to succeeding philosophers to lift the breastworks of his argument and to bridge the chasms of his doctrine. More literally, Berkeley, first among modern philosophers, elaborated and expanded Leibniz's argument against materialism, and the idealists since Kant's day have at least approached more nearly than Leibniz approached both to the reconciliation, within the finite self, of uniqueness with relatedness, and to a cogent argument for the existence of a complete self. But we should be untrue to history if we fail to trace to its source in Leibniz's writings one of the most significant tendencies in contemporary philosophy, the emphasis upon the truth of personality.